What's up, girls? I just read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Carl Jung. This is the third Carl Jung book that I've read. The first was Man and His Symbols, which they recommend to read first if you're going to read any Carl Jung. And then I read Modern Man in Search of a Soul. Both of those books are great. They were like a series of essays. Memories, Dreams, and Reflections is an autobiography, more or less, written with one of his proteges, Amelia Jaffe. Um, and it's a very interesting autobiography. I think, you know, because he was so focused on consciousness, um, and kind of used his own psychology as an instrument to understand like human psychology and consciousness as a whole. He keys in on the important events of his life that I think gave him kind of big insight, um, as to why the human mind is the way it is, why the unconscious acts the way it is. Um, and it's pretty cool. He starts off in his early life, and he even documents like some interesting, almost like seemingly trivial incidents. Like at school, he talks about how um, he wasn't the best student, but he was pretty smart, and then he was really interested in this one subject, and he wrote this paper, and the teacher accused him of plagiarism, but he hadn't plagiarized it. And back then there was no way to prove you hadn't copied something really, other than like you know the work was too good compared to the other work he had turned in that far thus far. So it's interesting. I guess he's kind of crediting that to like, if you're really interested in something, you can kind of dig deep inside of yourself and be more in tune, be more attuned to like, a subject, have knowledge of a subject that you shouldn't, which is interesting. Um, he also talks about his father being a Christian pastor, and I think this was like a very important point of reflection for him on religion, because he kind of says his father didn't embody like, you know, he didn't have a real like lived spiritual existence, and yet he was this kind of authority figure on religion, and that was his title and his job, which I think is interesting. I think a lot of people feel that way about, um, you know, the history of organized religion as a whole, and like kind of how we've inherited organized religion is that like you tend to look for examples, that like disprove, um, the religion. You look for like bad actors within the organization to be like, well, it's all kind of a facade. Look at this example of this bad behavior and whatever. But in doing that, you don't really get to look at the actual religious purpose. It's more of like you're more kind of, um, taking like an anthropological approach and being like, people are still people, um, and religion doesn't necessarily solve for like a bad personality or a bad actor. He documents a lot of his, um, like sessions that he had with different clients once he became a psychologist, and they're crazy. Um, there was one woman who, she was a very wealthy aristocrat, and she was in the habit of hitting people, like hitting the help. And when she tried to go to a psychologist, she would hit the psychologist and rationalize it as like, well, like, he's on my payroll. And so when she came to Carl Jung, Carl Jung says that when she, you know, once he started to try to go deep with her, she stood up and like cocked back her hand, and he stood up across from her and is like, all right, well, ladies first, but I'm going to hit you back. And that was the only way that he could break through, um, that like neuroses was to stand up to her because no one was willing to stand up to her because of like her class and social position. There's some really interesting stuff like that in there. There was also another guy who um, he had been taking money from like a childhood teacher of his who was kind of obsessed with him, and um, he didn't consciously perceive it to be morally wrong. She was she was spending like inordinate sums of money to send him to Saint Moritz, um, or the south of France, and he was accepting it because it was her choice, it was her free will. Um, when he found this out, Carl Jung was like, um, I guess in the book at this point he's reflecting on how the unconscious does kind of have like an understanding of morality, and that even though this guy had like consciously rationalized to himself that it was okay because it was her choice, that his unconscious was not okay with kind of exploiting this woman who was obsessed with him. um he talks about a lot of travel that he did, going to Africa and India. um he reflects kind of endlessly on reincarnation and Eastern spiritual practices. Um, he spends a lot of time talking about his own dreams, and he's very well versed in all religion, but Christian religion especially, because of his family life and because it's just the dominant religion in the West. So often, in his dreams, his unconscious would speak to him through like religious characters in his dreams. Philemon was one of them, I remember. Um, and yeah, he's a really fascinating, cool guy. Um, I love all of his work. This book made me feel like he was like a little bit crazy, but in a cool way. Um, and even though he's like kind of a scientist or approaching things from the angle of psychology, he does almost feel kind of mystical or prophetic, you know. Um, and he's clearly like a big inspiration for a lot of, um, the greatest thinkers of the last now 60 years or so. Uh, yeah. Um, I think I will just leave it at that. He talks also in this about Freud and how he got in touch with Freud and reading the interpretation of dreams, and then their kind of eventual falling out. Um, and basically that Freud, you know, kind of fell in love with his own ideas and wasn't really able to collaborate or like improve his own ideas, even though his own ideas were so groundbreaking. Carl Jung was trying to improve upon all the kind of frameworks he offered. Primarily that, Freud kind of tackled everything from the tragic angle, you know, um, from the Oedipus tragedy. And like Carl Jung always thought that um, that was inherently true for Freud, that his life responded the most to that structure, kind of like this family sexual tragedy, but that wasn't a universal truth. And that was one of the mistakes that Freud had made, is to assume that, everyone else was like him in that way. Um, but, Carl Jung is known for doing a lot of work on archetypes and different types of people and um, whatever. But been really cool to read his stuff. For me personally, I've been uh, dream journaling some more and really paying a lot more attention to my dreams. It's interesting, like, you know, that we spend 8 hours a night dreaming, like a third of our life. Um, I know you don't dream the whole time you're asleep, but we spend like a third of our life asleep. And for the REM portions of that, we're dreaming. And then we don't, at least for me, like, I would sometimes, think about my dreams if I had like a very crazy or topical dream, but I would always kind of, be a little detached and be like, oh, like, it's random. Um, but I'm starting to think that they're actually very important and meaningful. So I definitely recommend Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Carl Jung. Thanks for watching.